Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight as we commemorate the bombing of Hiroshima by honoring those affected by nuclear war and sharing a message of peace. My name is Raluca Barbu, and I am the Adult Programming Specialist at the Algonquin Area Public Library. This is a program made possible through the collaboration of Morton Grove, Messenger, St. Charles, and Algonquin Public Libraries. We are honored to welcome Clinton Fairbanks, co-author of the book 90 Seconds Past Midnight, An Atomic Survivor Story. He will guide tonight's peace-centered program, which pays tribute to Masakazu Saito, a 101-year-old survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. This is a Zoom webinar, so your microphone and camera will be turned off as an attendee. You can enable closed captioning and ask questions through the Q&A feature, and Clinton will gladly answer them throughout the presentation. A recording of this program will also be available on the YouTube channel of your library until September. I will now turn it over to Clinton. Good evening, Clinton.
Good evening, Raluca. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me here. I'm going to quickly restart my video presentation, but first, I just wanted to do a quick sound check, make sure we're all good.
I can hear you fine. I think it's all good. Yes.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to pull up my screen share one more time, and I will confirm that you can see my screen.
I can see you and I can see the screen. Yes.
Fabulous.
And I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, welcome everybody. I really appreciate all of you coming tonight to listen to an incredible story. This story changed my life a quarter of a century ago while I was working for the Japanese government in a very, I would want to call it the Maine of Japan or the Vermont of Japan, way up at the top of the main island. Echoes of Hiroshima. This is a presentation that my wife and I put together based on the book that we've pulled, that we took from Mr. Saito's story. This book is published on Amazon, and we are looking to get this whole message out. This is the final testimony of Mr. Saito, who just recently passed away this last December 30th to be exact. I missed giving him a call 2 days because I was going to be giving him a call on January 1st, which is a Japanese holiday called Shogatsu. And Shogatsu is the equivalent of Christmas for the Japanese. And I felt that it would be nice to call him on Shogatsu and tell him all the wonderful things that we were doing for him. And it was, I missed him by 2 days. And 3 weeks ago, I was giving this presentation at the Winnetka Library, and something dawned on me that this was the first time that he was able to see me give the presentation in person. And so I felt comforted by knowing that he was watching down on me. So I know that I have a calling, that I need to get his story out and need to continue letting people know what he dealt with. So that way we can't continue to repeat the same issues. The most important thing to bring peace is that we really need to learn from the past. We need to inspire from the future. If there's any message I can give to anyone today, is that if you have any animosity towards anyone, my request is go home, find that person that you have animosity towards, go give them a hug and say, thank you for being my brother, thank you for being my sister, because we all are here on this planet once. And it really, we're in a period where we're in a powder keg, not only between nations, where nations are close to going to war and with the threat of nuclear war, but even within our own societies, we're doing everything to divide us. And so instead of saying it's the other side, first, this is the one thing I learned from Mr. Saito when I was talking to him in my earliest discussions, was that peace comes because he's the one who decides that he's going to forgive. And forgiveness comes first from our end. And so this is where I really want people to take this message and understand that there were a lot of horrible things that ultimately ended up causing this catastrophic event. And so as we really learn from the past, I want us to really come out and say, let's change our future and let's change it quickly. The one and the most important thing is that Hiroshima was a very, very important, I like to call it a pivot point in the history of the world. And this is something that I have to make a pilgrimage to Hiroshima sometime. I have yet to go there. But the one thing I do know is that I lived in Japan for 7 years. And every summer during their Bone Festival, people do what you would call Toro Nagashi. And that is a peace lamp. And Toro Nagashi is where the candles are lit to represent the soul of a lost individual. And the Hiroshima peace lamps, they're really deeply moving. I've seen events like this on video. I've seen them in person in Tokyo and where I lived at the top of the main island. But every year in Hiroshima on August 6th at the Hiroshima Peace Park, they take these lamps and they're paper lanterns with a candle inside. They float on the Motoyasu River, which the Motoyasu River at that time was not a river anymore. It was something even worse, and I'll dive into that later on in the presentation. But people write the name of the victims, family members write the name. They pray for their family members. And they write pieces of messages like peace and never again, rest in peace. May we all come together. And so it really is, it's a most amazing festival. My wife has seen it in person. My wife is from Osaka. And to be able to see it in person, it's basically honoring the 140,000 people who died on that day. So really, as we come into this, I want people to know that Hiroshima, for most of us, Hiroshima is it's stories in a book. It's black and white pictures. It's something that unless we've gone to Hiroshima and seen the building and the Peace Park, for most of us, it's just an image. But Hiroshima is more or less a reality. Very few buildings, because in Japan, most of the homes were made out of wood framed homes. They instantly burned up in the destruction, and it was only buildings that were of concrete or of cinder block or brick that actually survived. So my goal is I'm bringing a little bit of color through this presentation today based on what happened to me 25 years ago. So 25 years ago, Mr. Saito came to me to share his story. I was working for the Japanese government. I was an interpreter. I was a coordinator for international relations. And so I spent a lot of time working with individuals. I would go and interpret for foreigners at hospitals. I had the honor of interpreting for multiple ambassadors. Even the Canadian ambassador, I interpreted for him at several events throughout this. But what Mr. Saito did not know is that he wanted to share his story with me. He didn't know my level of Japanese. And so what he did is he came to me giving me watercolors and putting his story into vibrant illustrations. So not only was the word, not only is it what we say, a picture worth 1,000 words, in this case, his pictures were worth 1,000,000 words. My life changed. We created a website for him. We were featured in multiple newspapers and throughout the country. And then I came back to the United States. I got involved. I went on to my normal life of going to graduate school, getting a job, and for 24 years, I pretty much put it on the back burner. And then it was about 2023 that something knocked on my door, in my mental door. I was doing my meditation in the morning, and all of a sudden, I felt something so strong inside. It was a whisper. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice coming to me and saying, "Clinton, you are obligated to get this out." So I went to my wife. I pulled up the images again. I pulled up the script, and I showed her what we had done, because 24 years ago, we held the first bilingual program to introduce his story to foreigners living in that local area. So we took the script, we took the images, and we then started creating and building this book. It's called 90 Seconds Past Midnight, because this basically talks about how it's Mr. Saito's experiences once he woke up from the blast. For everybody this summer, I had the opportunity to go to Japan and do a final recording of his voice. And so I want everyone, I'm going to go ahead and I want everyone to hear him say it in his own words. Mr. Saito is, it translates out to, the atomic bomb is something truly frightening, extremely terrifying. And it is his with absolute resolve that now is the time for our world, that we must ensure that this bomb can never be detonated. We should make sure that no one ever suffers the effect of the atomic bomb ever again. So Mr. Saito this is a story of absolute survival. It is a story of him being able to survive multiple encounters with death. So at the age of 20, he was stationed in Hiroshima. He was a squad leader in the communications division for the Imperial Army. His barracks were located 1,800 meters from the epicenter, and so he was very close. To give you kind of an idea, within the epicenter here, as you'll see within these areas, almost within the black circle here, the mortality rate was close to 93%. Those who survived, they were mainly in concrete buildings like the one you saw earlier. And as you started spreading out, the mortality rate started to expand. So ultimately, around 7,000 feet from the hypocenter, that's where the mortality rates were. They were only about 10%. So to give you an idea, the city population of Hiroshima on the morning of August 6th was 350,000. on the evening of August, and it is basically, they believe that on that day 140,000 people perished. Many died. Many died from instantly. Others died from the firestorms. Some then died from immediate radiation sickness, burns, and injuries. And so this is one of those where, Mr. Saito was one of the lucky ones to survive, but was he really lucky? So it all started the morning of August 6th. Mr. Saito, this story is just amazing, because as I continue to go through this, you'll see that he was in the right place at the right time in many events. He could have been taken away just like that. Mr. Saito, he was standing against a window. He had been on guard duty. And what had happened is air raid sirens had continued to go off the night before. So his whole platoon, they were exhausted from being up all night. So the commander gave them all permission to sleep in. And so within his bunk, within his platoon, most of his platoon members were upstairs sleeping in the barracks. And it was him, his platoon commander, and another individual that they were sitting. And Mr. Saito, you could see him here. He is the one standing with his back against the window. He was talking to his squad leader, his platoon commander, and the platoon commander was all excited. They were all having the feeling that the war was going to come to an end here soon. They knew that time was running out, and his platoon commander, all he could do was talk about he was just recently married. And so when he was discharged, he was going to go on a honeymoon with his wife, and he was all excited about making a family. The next thing you know, an intense heat came. Mr. Saito, basically, he was knocked to the ground. And as he was knocked to the ground, his platoon commander and the other one, the barracks, the beams that were holding and supporting the second floor above came down on him, and the rest of his platoon went basically flying through the air. Mr. Saito went unconscious, and then he woke up, and he had to escape a burning building with what he had on his person. So then this is where I would call 90 seconds past midnight, is that this is where his experience began. His story is that as he survived, he was able to crawl out of the barracks. And after that, he went to a clearing, and he ordered those survivors of his platoon to gather. So out of 400 men, only 38 survived. The unfortunate event here is that they had to leave many people behind. They heard screams, they heard yells, they heard calls for help within the building, but the fires were coming, and they had to move on quickly to save themselves. And there was no way that they could go in and remove the rubble and help their fellow soldiers. So Mr. Saito, him and his platoon, they started making their way towards a field hospital. But then the next thing they knew, there was a fire coming, and so they found what they would consider a quick air raid shelter. He doesn't remember the exact number of people in there with him, but he thinks it may have been 4 or 5 people that they were together with. And they could hear the sound of the fire. The crackling was so intense. The heat was burning them up. They felt like they were in an oven. And they all decided that it was time that they were all going to die together. So they all said their goodbyes. And miraculously, just as they said their goodbyes, the thermal winds shifted and pushed the fires into a different direction. So they were able to escape. So Mr. Saito then knew that he needed to walk and take his platoon. So his platoon, those who could walk, they walked. Those who could carry others, carried others. And then they started to make their way to what would be a field hospital. They knew of an evacuation zone, so it was one of those emergency areas in Japan where they would set up that it would be if the case the hospitals were to be destroyed, they would have a mobile hospital that they could go to. This is one of those where Mr. Saito and his team, they continued on. I have omitted certain numbers of slides in here because of the graphic nature of them, but in the book, there's a slide here of things that Mr. Saito had to do in order to relieve the pain of those who were suffering on his way. He called it the road to hell, and he could not believe what he was seeing. As they were walking to the field hospital, the rivers were black. They were full of cattle. They were full of livestock. They were full of anything and everything. They were full of bodies floating down the river. And then he would notice that people would be jumping into the river to see if they could get reprieve, but the water was boiling in some cases. So it not only was it a jumping into the river, they were jumping in to certain death. This is where Mr. Saito knew that he had to do something drastically, but he just continued on his way to the field hospital because he knew he had to get his people there. And as they walked to the field hospital, his platoon continued to pick up survivors to help. He looked over onto the mountains, and all he could see was the burning of trees and smoke. And this is, if anyone can imagine what hell was, this is what it was. As he made it to the field hospital, he's here with his katana. You can see him. He started talking at the emergency field hospital. It was a elementary school. For any of you who've ever been to Japan, you will notice that the country is extremely crowded. The cities are building upon building and upon building. And it really is. It's the elementary schools, the junior high schools, and the high schools that are some of the few places that actually have vast areas of land. So this is where the emergency evacuation was designated. And as they got here, the school itself, the roof had been blown off, the windows were blown out, parts of the wall were missing, but they still used the building to, so they could bring in the injured. And they just couldn't fill the injured into the building as quick. It was just so overcrowded. He was then ordered by his commander to leave and go collect other survivors and bring them back to the field hospital. And so Mr. Saito, he went and he made his way out. But Mr. Saito, by this time, several hours had passed. It was now more or less the afternoon, and he was exhausted. He was so exhausted. So he basically, as he's going down, he had gone out. He started helping people, started bringing them back, and then on the following day, this is again, he's now gone almost 24 hours without sleep, without food. He was on the verge of just breaking down. He found a house that had been damaged or had fallen down, but basically the roof had provided a shelter. So he decided to go under the roof, and from there he lost consciousness. Mr. Saito went into he was almost comatose. He went into a deep sleep, so deep that it was one of those nightmares. Um, you know, I've had them. I know many of you have probably had them. Where you're in a nightmare where you can't wake up. You're trying to move and you're trying to speak and you're trying to scream. That's what he was in. Mr. Saito was here right in the middle. When he woke up, he woke up to the sound of crackling fire. He woke up to the smell of something terrible. What he didn't realize was he actually was waking up from almost a 2, maybe 3 day sleep. And this is where he didn't know this at the time, but he's sitting here in a in this way where he can't move, he can't speak. And the next thing you know, they're ready to throw his body into a fire because they had to, the military that had come in, those who were coming in to help, were basically quickly burning and cremating the bodies. So Mr. Saito, he did everything he possibly could. And even though he didn't, it was lucky for him that as one of the soldiers went to pick up his body, they saw his eyes blinking. They saw him trying to move, trying to speak. And that's when they were able to um, take him out of the pile and say, "Oh, he's living. Let's put him over with the other injured." During my discussions with Mr. Saito, it was really he explained to me that he believed that there were other people who had been cremated and that were also in the same comatose like state. He can't imagine how many people were burned alive. But this is one of those where he just again, he was seconds from cremation. Mr. Saito then, it's one where as he was put into the area for the injured, he had been confirmed that he was alive. He then felt he was suffocating because the smell of the cremation. He was only 10 meters, so possibly about 30 feet away. So all he could do was smell the burning of bodies. And he just continued to, he was there for a full day. And it was just what was going through his mind. He just couldn't fathom what was happening. It was then he realized the extent of his injuries. At this field hospital, this makeshift hospital, it's very interesting because he actually has to say he kind of believes that he owed his life to maggots. By this time, his back had been completely burned. He had his face had multiple injuries, and the flies over the course of the past couple of days had infested and planted their eggs. And the next thing you know, he was being infested with maggots. He was infested with flies, and it's one of those where he actually, again, he couldn't describe how terrible it was. And when he was describing it to me, he you could tell he felt itchy. He felt like as if that memory had been burned into him permanently. So I am going to before I go to the next slide. Does anyone have any questions, any comments about Mr. Saito and his journey? Because I'm going to now move into some facts about that day. If you do, feel free to raise your hand or feel free to throw any questions into the chat. Okay. So in comparison, Hiroshima had 45 hospitals. It had close to 300 doctors and close to 1,800 nurses. prior to the morning of August 6th. The total number of hospitals that were able to intake patients that remained were 3. The total number of doctors that remained were 28. And the total number of nurses that survived were 126. Those were immediately within Hiroshima. Mr. Saito, the real interesting thing is that it took a few days before the Red Cross and before other organizations were able to come in and start helping the survivors. It is actually estimated that there were a total between both Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone. Hiroshima, 140,000 people died immediately. 70,000 people died immediately in Nagasaki. And the government estimate was that there were a total of 660,000 hibakusha, which would mean people who were affected by the bombing. And the reason why is that there were about 500,000 people, or there was about 450,000 people who directly lived in the city. But then there are the 150,000 individuals that also included Americans. It included Koreans and Chinese. Those were the people who entered the city afterwards to help. These were the people who came, and they ended up suffering. Several American soldiers came in as those who were in walking around and ultimately looking at the devastation. Many of them were affected by cancer and radiation sickness as well. Mr. Saito, he spent his lifetime from his injuries. His immediate injuries were multiple symptoms, from fevers to being nauseated to vomiting. And I've got to go back to this slide. Fever, vomiting. The most important, the one thing that Mr. Saito suffered the most was his lifelong injuries. The lifelong injuries were the cancer, the potential for cancer. It was his asthma. It was his issues with his scars and his burns. The most important, the one thing that I learned from Mr. Saito is that because he was standing against the window, the glass of the window, it had melted because it was at something in the area of 6,000 degrees of Celsius. The glass vaporized. It went into his skin, went through his muscle, and fused to the bones on his back. So for a lifetime, for over 80 years, Mr. Saito lived with glass fused to his back. So whenever there was high pressure, or whenever there was any sort of high pressure or changes in the weather, he would feel the effects constantly. When I first met Mr. Saito, he was at the time around 74 years old. And he told me that every day he was worried about dying of cancer. And I said, Mr. Saito, you got to understand, you're 70 years old. You're in better health than most 60-year-olds. And you are just like a tank. You're built to last. I said, I don't think you have to worry about dying from cancer now. And sure enough, Mr. Saito, he made it another 26 years. Mr. Saito would go down to Hiroshima. He went to Hiroshima in the 1990s. And when he went there, he heard about the story of the Hiroshima flying castle. He met a guy, Mr. Sugida, who was telling his story of that the Hiroshima castle had been, because of the blast explosion, it had been propelled into the air about 25 meters or approximately 75 feet. As he did this, as he heard this story, in talking to the individual, there were stories like this all over, and so you didn't know which ones to believe or which ones were over exaggerated. But Mr. Sugita went propelling into the air, and he survived, and he survived to tell his story. So this is one of those where it dawned on Mr. Saito that the power of the Hiroshima blast could do that. And then he realized what the power of our nuclear weapons are we have today. Mr. Saito, he spent his entire life working to abolish nuclear weapons. He spent his life going around the world, giving interviews, going to peace events, going and making sure that this would be a weapon that could never be used again. He knows that this is our destruction will come because of nuclear weapons. If they are in the hands of irresponsible leaders, if they are in the hands of anyone, that's why we have to put safeguards in. Personally, I know we're in a Pandora's box where once the nuclear weapons are out, it's very difficult to put them back in and abolishing them. But I do know is that from my discussions with him is that there were a lot of events that led up to the bombing. There were a lot of events that actually led up to why Japan and the United States went to war. And unfortunately, we're repeating a lot of those same steps today. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, is that this is one of those where we have to learn from the past. Everyone, I can't stress enough, it's not a Democrat thing. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a Russian or a Chinese or an American or any foreign nation thing. It's a human thing. Mr. Saito knew that it was the dehumanization of the Americans that continued to allow Japanese to believe that they were going to survive, they were going to be superior and victorious over the Americans. Likewise, it was the Americans' absolute hatred for the Japanese that led to an overall war of what would be called the war without mercy. When I was talking to Mr. Saito, the most important question I asked him when he was sharing his watercolors with me was, Mr. Saito, do you hold any animosity for the pilots or any American who was involved in the atomic bombing? And his response was the most amazing thing ever. He said, no, I can't live with the mistakes of our leaders of the past. You can't live your future by living in the past. Mr. Saito came to me and said, the most important thing I did was forgive the Americans as quick as I could. Because living with animosity towards somebody for something that happened in the past is only going to make the future murky. It's only going to continue with the animosity. And the moment I heard that, I called up somebody who I was in Japan, and I called up a friend in the US who I was very angry with, and I called him and I said, hey, I'm very sorry. It's my fault. And I did that, and to this very day, that person, I still call that individual one of my best friends. So that's the message of peace that I implore everybody. It's not race, it's not political, it is a human thing that we have to put our differences aside. And I decided that, this is something that we don't learn all the history in school. We don't learn the history of the nuclear weapons and the bombing from the Japanese perspective. We don't learn that Japan was trying to surrender prior to the bombing. We don't learn a lot of our history. So what we learn is what we were taught in school. And unfortunately, the education doesn't always give the full thing. And this is why I strongly say to any of my friends who have a strong opinion about anything, before you watch the 20-second clip, before you watch the 15-second clip and make up your mind, watch the full 10-minute clip, watch the full 2 hours, because the sound bites is what caused the World War II. Mr. Saito said, "It takes two to go to war." The Japanese were influenced by the propaganda of the Japanese government. The Americans were influenced by the propaganda of the American government. And between that, it turned into a powder keg. So there's a lot of similarities that was happening with our current situations around the world. Now, I decided that I needed my children to meet and touch history. So this last summer, I had something telling me inside that I had to get over to Japan and see Mr. Saito. It definitely was a premonition. I'm not ashamed of saying this, but it was a spiritual experience that I was being told by a higher power that I had to go and I had to see my friend one last time. We had had two reunions in between this. I went to Japan. I went to Japan like 15 years ago, and then came to New York 10 years ago. So we met a couple times in between that, but never did I have a chance for my children to meet him. So I took my son and my daughter, and I took my wife. And we went to Japan and we met Mr. Saito. And you can see here he is. This is my daughter. This is my son. This is my wife. And then this is Mr. Saito's son, the guy who's giving the peace sign. Mr. Saito is an amazing story because he finally married at around the age of 60. And the reason for this is that Mr. Saito, he didn't face any sort of animosity from the Americans. He actually had faced a lot of discrimination from the Japanese. And the reason for this was after the war, because he was a hibakusha, which means a victim of the atomic bombing. Japanese didn't know what was causing it. There was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of basically people believed that radiation sickness was transferred by genetics. They believed that that this was people who had been in the bombing had their children were going to suffer birth defects. So it was always shunned upon by people having their children marry somebody who had been affected by the bomb. Mr. Saito, he married and he had a son named Takemaru, and Takemaru and I have kind of become, I almost want to say in a way, brothers, because I met Takemaru when he was like at 15 at the time. He was young, and we've kept in touch, and he's invited me to Mr. Saito's funeral. I want to implore to everybody, this picture here over on the right, you see Mr. Saito's hands. Those are scars from the bomb, those on his hand. And then you've got my son and my daughter, and they, that's 80 years. It's not even 80, it's 90 years in between. He was 101 at the time. My son is 11 and my daughter was 9 at the time of this photo. So, the reason why the book is called 96 and it's past midnight is because there's a very important thing we need to understand, is that we have a countdown to doomsday. And most of us, many of us, as we go on with our day-to-day lives, we're very much into thinking that tomorrow is going to come. Tomorrow is going to be there's always going to be tomorrow. But what we don't realize is that we know of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know of other issues. But many of us don't realize that we have what they call the nuclear clock. It's the doomsday clock. And at the time when my wife and I were starting to work on the book, we found it very fitting that, you know, Mr. Saito said he woke up about 90 seconds after the blast. And as we were doing the book, we realized, you know, at that time we were quote unquote on the doomsday clock. We were at 90 seconds to midnight. So this is one of those where the world events are real. The immediate pullout and the immediate cessation of any act of the Ukraine war, of everything, you know, we have nuclear powers that are threatening each other. We have China threatening Japan with nuclear war. We have conflicts that we have Russia threatening the United States with nuclear war. We have us, you know, um, it's all combined, and you know, we don't know whether we've even threatened nuclear war. But the reality is this: is when I was growing up in the 80s, and I watched a TV series on ABC called The Day After, and it explained what would have happened if there had been a nuclear war. And at that time growing up, we thought we had 30 minutes before any sort of impact from a missile. The reality is that submarines sit off our coasts on both sides. We have submarines that sit off the coasts of our quote unquote adversaries. And we now have something called hypersonic missiles. We also have, there's potentially nuclear arms in space. There's so much. And then not only that, but the technology now is such that a nuclear bomb can be carried even in a suitcase, and it could go off in a city. So this is one of those where we're so close. It's time to tone down the rhetoric. It's time to tone down what we're doing, and it's time to ask our leaders to put a stop to what's going on. And we need to ask our counterparts. I have friends who live in China. I have friends in Japan. I have friends in Europe. I've lived in 4 different countries. I've worked in 28 different countries. And the one thing I can tell you about all of us is that we all go to bed at night, wanting to wake up the next day. For those of us who have children, our biggest desire is to watch our children grow and succeed us. You know, we all wear clothes. We all eat. We all desire happiness. So we're all not that different. So my favor is, you know, everybody, the goal is I want to get this message out. I want to continue telling Mr. Saito's story. I want to inspire people to make change. We've asked people to help us because what we're going to do is we have received permission from Mr. Saito to use his voice. We made several voice recordings. We also made several videos, and he has given us permission to go ahead and use his voice, use his image, and we are going to animate this series using AI. We're going to have it so that Mr. Saito can give his presentation in his voice in any language in the world. And so we ask for people to come in and help us with this. We also ask, you know, if this story inspires you, please go to Amazon, please download and write a review on the book. It's 90 seconds past midnight. It really is. And if you are inspired at any, please buy a copy for your friends, pass it on, because everything helps as we continue to do these events and as we continue to move forward. I am going to, any questions, any comments, any thoughts from anyone online?
I don't see any questions, Clinton, but I wanted to tell our viewers that some of the libraries have already purchased this book, so it's available for checkout through the libraries. Um, I wanted to thank you so much for this meaningful presentation, and honestly, I truly appreciate you sharing this powerful story and this message of peace, and I hope it was good for everybody to hear this. Um, Thank you so much, Clinton, for the presentation. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. And
Well,
the
thank
recording
you.
will, thank you. The recording will be available in a few days, most likely at the beginning of the next week. If some of the registrants, missed the presentation, they can certainly watch it. Thank you again. And oh, here's a question. Why did Mr. Saito say maggots saved his life?
Very good question because the maggots saved his life because they were eating the tissue that of his body. So the rotting flesh, the maggots were actually consuming that. So it was actually a way to kind of know how we use pumice stone to break off dead skin. It's kind of that same concept as the maggots were eating the rotting flesh, and so the new flesh could grow instead of staying on his body.
Wow. Nature helping out.
Yes,
Um, yeah. Excellent presentation, says Kim. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Clinton. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
thank you.